Hey everybody, what's going on? Hexlex here. I got another Master Duel video for you. So today we're going to be taking another look at the Duelist Cup. Now that the Duelist Cup has concluded, the second stage included, now I wanted to go ahead and take a look at the breakdown of some of the decks so we can kind of get a feel of what the current metagame is like, at least according to the statistics from the Duelist Cup here. So let's see, we have data that is compiled from a total of 631 decks that were submitted over to MasterDuelMeta.com. This was over the course of the entire Duelist Cup. We're going to look at the 631 decks that got max level. And then on top of that, we also have some stats on the top 10 overall decks of the whole Duelist Cup, like from the second stage. So the decks that got max level and then got the most points during that second stage there. So I'd like to take a look at this data because not only does it give us a pretty good indication of what the current metagame looks like, because of course naturally people are going to bring their best and or most competitive decks to this Duelist Cup. However, in addition to that, we're also going to be seeing that this will give us a little bit of an insight onto what Konami is possibly going to hit on the ban list as well, because as we all know, Konami pays definite attention to what's used in the Duelist Cup in order to kind of gauge maybe where things should or shouldn't be on the ban list there. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Before we do though, real quick, I want to show off the stats that we did last time we did a meta analysis. This one was for decks that hit Diamond rank for about 2 weeks back in February. This was about a month ago. So at that time, and indeed pre-Ishizu as a whole, we were seeing that Runic Sprite was very much dominating the meta. I mean, look at this, at 21.9% representation. 21.9% for one deck is kind of insane. It's definitely the most that I've seen on any one of these given meta breakdowns that we've done so far, or at least from what I can recall anyway. So yeah, we're seeing that Runic Sprite was hugely dominant, followed by Pure, and then Twin Sprite. Branded Despia hanging in there. Exosister was still relatively new at the time, but it's definitely still a respectable deck in its own right, and of course tended to counter a lot of the graveyard strategies that Sprite was using fairly well, because although they're not technically a super like graveyard reliant deck, Sprite did often rely on bringing stuff back from the graveyard. So, and then we had Mathmech and Pug and Dino Morpheus, Spiral, so on and so forth. So again, this was pre-Ishizu. This was the pre-Ishizu meta for Diamond 1 in Season 14. Now let's go and take a look at the Duelist Cup max level decks. So again, these are of a total of 631 decks that were submitted to Master Duel Meta. We're seeing Sprite actually at pretty much the same percentage, almost 8.6, 8.9%, but this time Pure Sprite being at 8.9% puts it at top of the of all these decks here. So already we're seeing a huge difference in that. When the most represented deck is only 8.9%, it's definitely not nearly as dominant as the top deck being 21.9% representation. Coming in below that, we actually have Sword Soul Tenyi, who did not make an appearance at all on the last pie chart, but now we're seeing here in second place at 7.3%. Branded Despia is going to bring up the third place there at 5.9%, followed fairly closely by Flandreese at 5.2%. Then after that, we actually see our first Ishizu, or I guess like dedicated Ishizu deck. That's going to be Ishizu Chaos. For those who don't know, Ishizu Chaos refers to that Necroface kind of style mill deck that I'm sure you're all at least somewhat well acquainted with. A lot of us I know are very well acquainted with it. So that was coming in at 4.8% here. Then we have Runic Sprite, quite a fall from 21.9% at 4.4% representation in his deck number, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sixth place, as opposed to the far and away number one spot last time. We'll definitely talk about that here in a minute. Rika is going to follow up that with 3.5%. Adamancipator and Mathmech were each represented at 3.2%. And then we have our other category at a much healthier 53.6% as opposed to 39.3% during our last analysis. So, what happened? There's a lot of huge changes here. Well, it's pretty, clear, I think, that the Ishizu cards happened, right? The Ishizu cards definitely came in and hugely shaped up the meta, not just by being powerful in their own right, as a milling strategy, but also the Shufflers. The Shufflers are such a key piece of disruption in this meta, really just in general, and they are especially helpful in this meta, though, against the Runic Sprite deck. So Runic decks in general definitely struggle against the Shizu decks because when they target 3 cards to put back with Fountain, you can chain the Shuffler's effect and then just target the same 3 cards, and then you'll tuck them back into the deck. But because it wasn't done by Runic Fountain's effect, the opponent will not get to draw any cards, and that is a huge factor as to why we're seeing Runic Sprite have such a hard drop. And just like the last list, I mean, if I'm remembering right, yeah, we're not seeing pure Runic represented at all here as a tiered deck anymore. Again, that's actually been the case for a while now, but when we take a look at the Rogues Gallery here in a moment, which is, you know, when we dive into this other category and see kind of in order the decks in that, we're going to see that Runic Stun or like pure Runic decks or even like Ishizu-based Runic decks, they're all kind of like lumped in the same category by Master Duel meta, and they're all, even as a collective category, fairly low down on the list there. Now, this could be due to an issue of reporting. It could be that maybe there are a decent number of, you know, stun Runic players that are not reporting their wins to Master Duel meta. But you could really make that argument for any one deck on this list, and even within the scope of that, it's very likely not to such a degree that it would cause like a massive discrepancy of this caliber. So, I mean, I'm talking like, you know, we had, I think, what was it, 5 or 6 like Runic, like pure Runic decks submitted, as opposed to like, you know, even Mathmech and Adamancipator, the bottom of the represented decks on the pie chart here, each had about like 20 decks represented. So it would have to be, if that were the case, it would have to be a lot of people winning with it and then not reporting. So this tier list would seem to indicate that Pure Sprite is in fact the top tier 1 deck, which I don't think is much of a surprise to anyone. Seeing Sword Soul Tenyi come in second, though, definitely surprised me. I mean, I did expect to see it a bit more, but definitely not this much. We'll talk about some possible reasons why that might be the case here a little bit later when we look at notable data trends. We do actually have a little bit more data to look at before we dive into that, but I think the other thing that really surprised me the most here was Rika being represented as highly as it was. Not that I think Rika is a bad deck or anything. I do think it's definitely a fine deck, but I wouldn't even really put it at tier 3, honestly. I do think it is I consider at least a upper rogue deck, so I guess you could make a case for it being tier 3. It's been putting up enough decent results that, you know, I don't know. It's really kind of something I go back and forth on. Really what it is I don't have personal experience playing the deck, and I haven't really played against it all that much. Every now and then, but not very often. So I guess it does kind of like get a little bit difficult for me to gauge in my head where exactly I think Rika is right now. But it is definitely a surprise to see it here. Adamancipator did not perform. I feel like I definitely overestimated Adamancipator due to how much I liked it, and also because of how powerful of a card Block Dragon is. I thought Adamancipator would definitely be more up here around like where Branded Despia is, but we're seeing it fairly far down, and as represented as Mathmech. If you had asked me if I thought Adamancipator would be in this exact same place in terms of representation as Mathmech, I would definitely have hard disagreed. I definitely would have said Adamancipator is a lot better, but we are seeing that it is probably actually just a tier 3 deck, despite the fact that it feels a lot more powerful when you play it, and when you play against it as well. Although, I can also attest that, like, you know, it's kind of one of those decks that fires on all cylinders, and if you can get the Block Dragon, then you're usually just going to win. And then if you can't, you're not just like, it's not an auto lose, but it becomes a much more of an uphill battle. And because the deck tends to, you know, fire on all cylinders when it makes its plays, it really needs that Block Dragon to recoup the advantage to continue plays, and or to help even close out the game when you're going second. So yeah, the deck, I mean, as it always has, kind of lives and dies by Block Dragon, which is still a ridiculous card, by the way. The fact that Adamancipator is this far down definitely does not mean that Block Dragon is like, it's probably not okay. And again, this is coming from somebody who loves Adamancipator. Block Dragon's probably not okay to exist, especially when you consider that Vernu Sylphs are probably coming out very soon. So that'll be fun. You know, I mean, I'm gonna have fun playing that deck, but when I say it'll be fun, that's more of a indication of we're going to see how strong Block Dragon and then also Adamancipator as a whole really is. But yeah, I mean, aside from Adamancipator being lower than I thought and Sword Soul Tenyi being higher than I thought, in fact, I kind of thought their positions would be switched. Maybe Adamancipator not quite that high, maybe like 3rd or 4th, but still. The rest of this makes a lot of sense to me. I really like that we're seeing a highly diversified meta. Even if Ishizu cards like are not always the most fun to play against, you do have to admit that at the very least they caused enough of a shakeup in the meta that we're not still seeing, you know, any one deck at like over 20% representation. Not that that's like tier 0 category, like it's not even close honestly, but it's still a lot, especially for Master Duel, a format that because of its best of one nature and how much easier it is to obtain cards, is going to always be much more diversified. 21.9% is a lot. And again, especially for ranked ladder as well. So now that we've talked about these decks that did best, let's take a look at the Rogues Gallery. So Rogues Gallery are the top of the other category. Starting from the top left, going to the bottom right. These are the decks that are in the other category from most represented to least. And of course there are some below even this, but you know, I think at Tri-Brigade it was like 3 decks, you know, that were submitted. So at that point, all the other decks are like 2 or 1 people topped with it. But let's go through this Rogues Gallery here. So coming up at the top, we had Exosister followed by Punk and then Dynamorphia. This makes sense. We saw them quite a bit on the last Diamond 1 tier list that we took a look at as well. Exosister, definitely even more relevant, arguably more relevant now that Ishizu cards are around. Still does have still some of its same weaknesses of, you know, it's kind of an anti-meta deck, so if the deck that it's playing against isn't like super graveyard reliant, it's not as powerful. It's also still susceptible to a lot of the same disruption that other like meta decks are, such as like Maxi and Nibiru and Ash Blossom and all that stuff. So still a very good deck though, definitely a good deck. Punk, again, pretty expectant to see it around this power level, same with Dynamorphia. Dynamorphia I saw a lot of pretty early on. It seemed like a lot of people who were rushing were doing so with Dynamorphia because it's a particularly good anti-meta deck. It can play a lot of floodgates, but at the same time still has the ability to make some fairly explosive plays. So makes sense that Dynamorphia is a deck you would want to rush with. After that we see Hero and Spiral, those make sense as well. Sky Striker, Twin Sprite, Dragon Link. These are all more of the decks you would expect to see in the meta, just not quite as often as the decks we saw before, so that's all pretty expected. Coming to the second column, though, we're seeing Drytron, which I have not been seeing all that much personally, but definitely made enough of a splash to be included relatively high up in the other category here. Was about as played as Labyrinth, which I feel like I see more often. Now, to be fair, the number of times any one person faces a deck is never going to be indicative of how often that deck is used overall, because any one person's experience is just going to be too small of a sample size. You always need to look at the bigger picture here, which is what we try to do in these meta-analysis. After that is Adagnister, Endymion, 8-Axis, Blind Second, Marinesis, and then we have Runic Stun below that, or Pure Runic, whatever you want to call it. I have it listed here as Runic Stun. Master Duel Meta just calls it Runic, but again, I think if I recall correctly, their Runic category actually encompasses the Stun variants as well as the Ishizu variants as well. So Ishizu Runic, Pure Runic, Stun Runic, I feel like all of those fit in this category here, which again is a lot further down than I think a lot of people would expect to see it. I think a lot of people would expect, you know, Runic Stun. If you ask the right, or maybe in this case wrong person, they might even say like, oh, Runic Stun is still a tier 1 deck. That's actually a sentiment I see a lot, that like Runic Stun is, or at ever what point was tier 1. If you look back at our past metagame analysis, you can see like even by like a more objective definition, Runic Stun was never a tier 1 deck. It was always like tier 2 at best, and it was a very good tier 2 deck, and of course, you know, being tier 2 does still make you a very strong contender. I'm not denying that Runic Stun is a strong deck and also an annoying one to play against. However, I feel like sometimes people kind of let their emotional reactions to a deck allow their position, which they're trying to tout as objective, become more subjective. You know, if we look at the objective data that we have, we see that Runic Stun, if you actually go back and watch, you know, the meta-analysis videos, you can see it have a steady decline, and now here it's like very firmly in the rogue tier. So is it annoying to play against? Yes. Is it like broken and overpowered? No. Do floodgates still need to get hit harder in Master Duel? that is actually, believe it or not, an entirely separate discussion, which I think, you know, in some cases, yes. It's not like an urgent need, but I think for the overall health of the game, it's probably needed. But that's a topic for an entirely different video. That's actually an interesting. Let me know if you guys like to see like a more like discussion style video about floodgates in general. I guess that'd be more of an opinion piece on my part, but if that's something you're interested in, definitely feel free to let me know in the comments there. In any case, after Runic Stun, Pure Runic, whatever you want to call it, we see Tri-Brigade Sprite, followed by Adventure Phantom Knight. And then Adventure Prank Kids. I haven't seen this name even in like the road category in months, but yeah, I mean, I've said it before, Adventure Prank Kids is much like Adventure Phantom Knight in that it's honestly still a fine deck even after all the hits it's taken. Now, Adventure Phantom Knight I think was definitely more, like much more slept on because Destiny Fusion and the Water Enchantress being at 1 does not really impede that deck's ability to combo. In the same way that Adventure Prank Kids, you know, if you don't open the Adventure package, then you're not really going to get it. That wasn't the case with the Adventure Phantom Knight, but Adventure Pranks did get a second Fusion Destiny, so the DP package does become a little bit more consistent in that deck once again. But of course, you know, Meow Meow Moo was always the big hit to that deck. That said, the deck is still pretty fine, honestly, even with Meow Meow Moo at 1. It's a deck I like kind of mean to come back to every now and then. And I actually meant to test Prank Kid Sprite at some point, but I never got around to it. Again, if that's something you would like to see me do, definitely feel free to let me know. Following that, we have Crystal Beast, which I know a lot of people, and myself included, when I was first looking over the decks, I was like, oh, wow, really that many Crystal Beast decks? But like, I say but, like this, you know, negates the fact that they do well. It is cool that Crystal Beast can do well in 2023. Now, what I was about to say is, they mostly do so on the back of Necro Valley. I think all of them were like just jamming 3 Necro Valley. However, again, I don't think that necessarily takes away from the accomplishment that, you know what, Crystal Beast is out here doing well. Good for them. Good for them. Then, of course, we have Dark Magician following that. Dinos, Eldritch, Shizu Mill. This is more of like a quote-unquote pure Shizu deck that's not using like Necroface Chaos stuff to mill. It's just kind of playing like fairies, which is a deck I thought about brewing, but you know, I didn't want to craft. I had this like whole brew in mind of that ran 3 Diviner and 3 Christia, but I was like, I can't justify spending 180 Ultra Aircraft points just to cook for a little bit, and I'm ultimately glad that I didn't. So yeah, we have that. That's again, a Shizu Mill is more of a pure quote-unquote a Shizu deck that's not using Chaos stuff in Necroface. And then we have a few Tri-Brigade variants, like Tri-Brigade Lyrilusk, Scareclaw, which mostly ran Tri-Brigade stuff from what I remember seeing, and then more pure Tri-Brigade stuff, maybe a couple splashing branded engines there. So, all relatively expected stuff for the Rogues Gallery. Again, it's interesting to see how far Runic Sun has fallen. Adventure Prank Kids, cool to see that come back, and cool to see Crystal Beast here as well with that new support, and Necro Valley, but also the new support. Alright, so now let's talk about the top 10 decks from the second stage, and gotta give credit to EdgarDom81539 over on Reddit, who posted this image there, very, very clearly breaking down the names of the top competitors, you know, how many points they got, and also what type of deck they were generally running. So, let's take a look at these decks here. Number 1 was actually in a Shizu branded deck. It might be a little bit hard to tell, but the 3 cards here are Kelbeck, Branded Fusion, and That Grass Looks Greener. Following that was Exosister. This card on the far left, I believe, is one of the Magistus cards. I don't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but it equips Artemis from the extra deck and then uses that to search. And then, of course, Magnifica and Secret Village of the Spellcasters. Very good Floodgate in this format. Then we have Punk, as represented by, of course, Ziamine, Foxytune, and then Amazing Dragon. Isn't that the level 11 Synchro's name, I think? Then we have actually 2 of the same deck after that. They're both actually Runic Stun decks. Funnily enough, despite me just getting done saying, oh, Runic Stun is in the Rogue category, it isn't that great. Here it is, taking spots at number 4 and 5, as represented by Inspector Border, Runic Fountain, and There Can Be Only One. So, what's up with that, huh? We'll actually talk about that here in a little bit. Number 6 was Unknown. I tried to look to see if there was maybe someone who knew what this deck was, but from what I could tell, I couldn't find it. To be fair, I didn't look very hard. If you know what it is, feel free to leave it in the comments below there. Number 7 is a grass-branded deck that did not appear to be using Ishizu stuff. So, as you can see, it's represented by the Fright for Patchwork branded fusion, and then that grass looks greener. Number 8 and 10 also were both more Ishizu branded decks, and then number 9 was Runic Sprite, as represented by Aperia, Gigantic Sprite, and Runic Fountain. So, pretty interesting that we have these decks as the top 10, because you would think, right, that stuff like Pure Sprite, Sword Soul Tenyi, Fluandereeze, those decks that we were seeing represent at the top of the percentage of decks that were submitted to max level are not seen at all here in the second stage top 10 decks. Why is that? Well, I think honestly the main reason is just the difference in how the stages are operated. You know, with the first stage, you had, like about a week and a half to get to max level, which if you really grinded at it, and especially if you were using a meta deck, you could do very quickly. However, the second stage plays out much differently, right? You have a limited number of time in which, during this period of time, you have to grind and get as many points as possible. And believe it or not, this structure actually greatly affects what decks are played. This like time and overall structure of the second stage. It becomes a lot more beneficial to not only metagame a lot harder and play stuff that is good against the meta in that regard, but also you want to play decks that can get very quick wins. Ishizu branded definitely has relatively quick wins. You can just jam out like Mirror Jade plus, you know, whatever you do on turn 1, whether it's Dragos Stapelia, whether it's like a Masquerade or 2 even. Also, if you're really interested in just time, you can just jam out double Masquerade, and that's often a way to win very quickly. The combo lines are not long, unlike stuff like Mathmech or Adamancipators or like Admixter or something like that, so you can do them in fairly good time. You have to really kind of look at it as like a power ratio or power level to time spent ending on that board ratio. Exosister and Runic Stun end up being really high in this regard because you might be thinking, well, a stun deck doesn't win very quickly, right? Well, here's the thing. In the second stage, it becomes very beneficial to concede very quickly if you don't have a very obvious way to win or if it's looking like you're going to lose, because, you know, it's more beneficial to take a quick loss and then get straight to the next game that you could win than spend a prolonged amount of time dragging out this duel that you're going to lose the same amount of points for no matter how quickly the game ends. So in that regard, Runic Stun and decks like Exosister that can just jam out a Dimensional Shifter on your opponent's first turn actually become a lot better, because as soon as you do that, your opponent's just going to concede. So in that regard, you end up getting quick wins with it. And then as far as like Punk and Runic Sprite goes, I mean, Runic Sprite I'm actually really surprised to see in the top 10 at all. That deck does not win very quickly, although to be fair, you could make an argument that it's the same as Runic Stun, right? When Runic Sprite kind of like does its full first turn cycle where it has a ton of advantage, and especially if it goes second, it leaves the opponent with, or not especially if it goes second, but sometimes when it goes second, it can just leave the opponent without barely anything at all on its first turn. So in that regard, I could see it getting quick wins, but definitely seems to be the quote-unquote slowest of the decks here. And then it could also be the same case as Punk, though, where it's like, could just be this person did exceptionally well with a deck they knew very well. That is always possible to be the case as well. Alright, so let's talk about some of these data trends in a little more detail here. As we mentioned earlier, the Runic variants have taken a huge hit in power level, misspelled power, nice, due to its position in the meta. The Ishizu Shufflers, Mudora, and Keldo hard counter the ability to gain more advantage through Fountain. And the other thing too is that lots of these 60 card decks have so much gas in them that they can play through Runic's Disruption relatively easily. Like, the 60 card decks don't really care about, Runic Destruction or Slumber, or usually Dispelling. Sometimes Dispelling can screw you over, but it's not that often. These more combo-based decks based around monster, like monster-heavy combos, really only need to worry about the Flashing Fire and the Freezing Curses as the main things that are going to stop them. And that's only 2 cards. It's 1 Destruction and 1 Negate. And a lot of these 60 card decks do not have an issue playing through that. So they don't really care if Runic Sprite ends up drawing a lot of cards, if they're just going to end the duel that turn, and they're only going to put up a couple of negates, in response. It's a kind of classic, control. Like Runic Sprite is very good against more like mid-rangey decks, but then you have the combo decks, which you could argue the 60 card Ishizu decks are more like combo decks. Those tend to be better against control decks, because again, combo decks don't care how much advantage the control deck generates. The combo deck is just going to win. It's just going to win with its play. So it doesn't care if Runic Sprite is going to draw like 8 cards. That's definitely an exaggeration. Of course, it's 3, but get like a +8 total to have fuel for the next turn, because that next turn is never going to come. So Sword Soul Brandon Flonderies. We saw these decks have a noticeable resurgence in play for the Duelist Cup. This is likely due to duelists favoring decks they're more familiar with to climb to max level. I think, well, to be fair, Branded Espy and Flonderies are actually both just good decks, period, right now. Not to say that Sword Soul Tenyi is bad, but again, to see it as the second most played deck very much surprised me. I definitely don't think the deck is that good in this meta. I think a lot of people ended up turning to it, again, because it was kind of like a comfort deck for them, right? Which, there's definitely something to be said for experience. Like, experience, if you're well versed enough in a deck, can very often overcome the power level gap that a deck you're piloting has with other meta decks. I mean, we see this all the time when people get, when people top MCSs with stuff like Sharks and Fluffles and Penguin Sprite. We're definitely seeing a skill gap there, but we're seeing the duelist piloting that deck being so skilled that it's bringing the deck up from it being so much lower power level than all the meta decks, and that's where the gap is. It's not that the deck is better than the player, it's that the player is like better than the deck, in a way, if you want to think of it that way, but excuse me. Alright. Yes, as we were talking about earlier, a lot of the top 10 was composed of rogue decks rather than decks that were represented in the max level decks, that were most represented in the max level decks. This is likely due to the nature of the short window of time in the second stage, which favors quick wins and meta calls over consistency. Again, we talked about this a little bit already, but don't take seeing these decks here as like these being the best decks of the format right now. That's not what this means. It just means that those were the best decks to grind a lot of duelist points in the second stage quickly. That's really all it means. Now, to be fair, Konami's still definitely going to take that into account when they do their ban list hits. They seem to always do that, but I wouldn't, again, take that as meaning that those are the best decks of this format necessarily. And in that vein, overall data from max level decks is more telling of the meta in the top 10 list due to differences in the first and second stage as indicated above. So again, I think that looking at overall everything that got max level is the better snapshot to take a look at if you want to know where the meta generally is at this point in time. So I think that's about all the time that I've got. I think that's about everything I wanted to say as well. I honestly had a lot of fun this Duelist Cup. I know a lot of people find the event very stressful, but definitely let me know what you thought about it in the comments below, and what you think of the information we see here as far as the meta as represented by the decks that hit max level, and also the implications of what got top 10 there. Yeah, I would definitely love to hear from you as always, but without further ado, let's just go ahead and move now to our outro. Alright everybody, thank you so much for watching all the way to the very end of the video like this. That means a whole lot to me. Not just personally, but it's also a great way of supporting the channel as well. If you're interested in supporting the channel in other means, you can of course feel free to comment and or subscribe right here on YouTube. I'm always looking to the comments section. You guys leave some pretty awesome feedback as far as like constructive criticism goes when it comes to deck building, gameplay, channel content, all that stuff. So feel free to leave your opinion down there. I will be sure to take a look at that there. And then subscribing is going to be the best way to get notifications of when these videos drop. That does happen every day, by the way, so if you're looking for daily Master Duel content, you've come to the right place. And there are more places where you can get some daily Master Duel content. If you check out the description below, follow the top link over to my Patreon page, there for just $5 a month, which is as much as you pay for a booster pack. You'll find a lot more value than a pack full of filler over there. We've got some previews for content upcoming here on the channel. We've got some exclusive games that are only posted over on Patreon over there. We've got some Q&As, and then you can also have your name featured in this lovely credit sequence where I thank all of the people who are helping contribute over there on Patreon. It's a huge support to the channel, and it really means a lot as well. So thank you everyone who is donating that is featured here on screen. And again, you know, it's not just a pure donation, you do get some more daily Master Duel content over there just for being a part of the Patreon. But I think that's about all the time that I have for today's video. Once again, I just want to thank you so very much for sticking all the way to the end of the video. Again, it just means a lot, as I do put a decent amount of work into getting these videos out every single day. But that's about all the time that I've got for now, so without further ado, this is Xlex. I'm signing out, and I hope you have a fantastic day.